much, folks. We are at the High-Speed Rail Authority item. We are at page 7 of our agenda. The first issue that we have teed up is a conversation that is focused around a joint statement that was issued by Congresswoman Anna Eshoo from San Mateo, Santa Clara, and Santa Cruz counties, as well as by Assemblymember Rich Gordon, who represents portions of San Mateo and Santa Clara counties, and myself. About a week or so ago, there was a joint statement that we issued. We did not attempt to design the entire system from San Francisco to San Jose. We did, however, lay out a few criteria that we thought were explicit and helpful with respect to what high-speed rail done right on that stretch of the corridor might look like. And we wanted to have a little conversation about that today. And I want to be very clear. All three of the folks who spoke, Congresswoman Eshoo, Assemblymember Gordon, and myself, continued to describe ourselves as supporters of high-speed rail done right. That's a phrase that I think we have been using for probably a year and a half now, or something like it. My own personal preference would have been to avoid the need to issue the statement. I have said repeatedly in a variety of forums, both here and in speaking with my constituents, designing the high-speed rail project for California is definitely outside my job description. That being said, after waiting a year and a half to have someone come forward and describe what high-speed rail done right looks like from the authority, I came to the conclusion that if I wanted to push the project in that direction, I was going to have to provide some at least broad outline of what I thought that looked like, and as it happens, my colleagues in government shared that view, as well as shared the view about what high-speed rail done right up and down that particular corridor looked like. I want to be very clear, and a copy of the statement is attached, that all of that is in the context of the larger project. I understand that folks have to make decisions with a statewide perspective, even as they are sensitive to local concerns. I think all three members of this committee at various times have indicated their agreement with that view, that local concerns need to be addressed, but that's as part of a larger debate and discussion about the system. And so what I wanted to do was ask folks from High-Speed Rail here today to respond to the statement and to have some conversation about that, because this is not just a question about impact on a local corridor. This is also a question about the very viability of the proposal in terms of its ability to move up and down that corridor, which means by definition it's also a conversation about the viability of the whole project, since the project has to get from one end of the state to the other, or it isn't a project under Prop 1A. It's also a financial issue. At the risk of stating the obvious, the funds are not unlimited for this project. And if anything, there's a great deal of ambiguity about where remaining funds in whatever amount, whether you think it's another $30 billion or another $50 billion, are likely to come from. So to the extent that we saw an opportunity to reduce costs up and down the corridor, that also, in our view, meant that the project writ large is more likely to be viable over the long haul if we can avoid unnecessary expense. Why don't I go ahead and just reference the items on page 8 and ask the High-Speed Rail Authority to introduce the folks who are here today. We appreciate their being here, and to respond and tell us how they could get to yes if that's possible, and if not, let us know that as well and tell us why not. Welcome.
Thank you, Mr. Chairman. My name is Roelof van Ark. I'm the CEO of the High-Speed Rail Authority, and I have with me Danae Eshoo, who's our counsel for CEQA and environmental issues, and Kerry Provahidi. She's here for the financial part if we get to it.
And could I ask the counsel, your last name is what again, please?
It's Aitchison, which is Aitchison.
Aitchison.
Aitchison, Scottish.
Thank you. Thank you, Ms. Wright. When I refer to someone, I'd like to have their name right.
I think you know Kerry Provahidi, also a bit of a difficult name, but she's been here more often.
Thank you, Ms. Provahidi. Welcome.
So, Mr. Chairman, members, firstly, thank you. I'd like to say thank you, firstly, for appointing 2 new board members to our board. This was, in my opinion, a great achievement. Bob Balganorth, who's actually here, he unfortunately has to leave because he's got another commitment this afternoon. as well as Jim Hartnett. I think both of them will be good contributors to the board of High-Speed Rail, and they both have been appointed through the Senate, so I think that's a good achievement. We greatly appreciate, and Senator SIMITIAN, you've often said that the commitment that you and also the other co-authors of the statement have to making high-speed rail happen, and also to your commitment to doing it right, because we also want to do it right. I obviously must tell you that our board has not given comment to your thoughts yet. We haven't had a board meeting or something, so the comments that I'm giving to you today, you know me, you've asked me to be open and fair and tell you the truth always, and that's what I will do, and I am a technical person, so I'm going to be giving you those inputs so we can understand them together. So we're committed to work together on something that you've put forward. We think we recognize the concerns of the people on the peninsula and the residents, and we want to work to address these concerns. I'm there very often myself, but also others do go there. We agree with you that there are great opportunities to enhance that corridor together with CalTrain, and I think you know as well, we have worked with CalTrain actually all the time we've been there, and Mike Scanlon and his staff and myself and my staff work very well together to try and find a way forward. We also agree that we should be looking at all possibilities to reduce costs for the system, and in fact to ensure that the combined system on the peninsula becomes something that people need and can benefit from. The long-term nature of the project requires that we continue to plan, you mentioned it yourself, for the entire system and for the longer term, and I think we'll touch on that again in our discussion. But this does not mean that everything is cast in stone, and obviously there's flexibility, and we have to talk about that as well. However, as we have communicated also with your office, we have questions about the blended system. And
Mr. Van Ark, I apologize
yes.
for the interruption. For my colleagues, the core of the proposal is that for that stretch from San Jose to San Francisco, that rather than think of this as two separate systems with duplicative costs and impacts along the corridor, that we think about how we can use existing infrastructure upgraded, and we call it a 21st century CalTrain, which presumably would involve electrification and positive train control, so that we can have a blended system that integrates a 21st century CalTrain with high-speed rail. That's the fundamental core of the notion. And the reason for that is so that we can avoid the 60-foot viaduct up and down the corridor, so we can stay within the existing right-of-way, and so that we can avoid the extra billions that would be associated with doing a duplicative system. And when we get to the conversation about what the entire system is in a minute or two, when I let Mr. Van Ark get back on point, I think that's when the conversation will get interesting in a hurry. Back to you, sir.
So obviously our main concerns revolve around two laws that we believe we do have to, we don't believe, we know we have to meet and work according to. The one is Prop 1A. And if I talk a bit about Prop 1A from just a few aspects I'd like to put on the table, and that's from an engineering or design perspective. There are some parameters that are very clear, and therefore we don't know how we together can find a solution to these. And the one is that we have to be able to travel the time in a time of 30 minutes between San Francisco and San Jose. So that is one issue in Prop 1A, which we don't know what the solution is on that recommendation on the blended system. Second one is we have to have a capability to transition intermediate stations or to bypass these stations at mainline operating speeds. We can go into a little bit detail a bit later on, but that is an issue that clearly also has a very strong limiting effect on the capacity of the line. You understand that the two systems, high-speed and commuter rail system, operate at very different modes. Commuter rail systems have to stop at basically every station. High-speed rail doesn't want to stop at every station, and that's why to meet 30 minutes, you've got to get past these trains, and you cannot get past the trains because you're behind them, where they are loading and offloading passengers along the corridor. So I think for that reason, Prop 1A actually very clearly specified that you have to bypass these stations so that when a train is in the station, you must be able to bypass it. And the next thing is, Prop 1A also refers and clearly states we have to have grade separation. Now, obviously, all these things may not be necessary right up front. And therefore, we have the other concerns from a legal perspective, and not maybe from a design perspective or an engineering perspective, from a legal perspective. We have the concern about the shortening of the planning horizon. Although high-speed rail is, we are fully on board with something I launched about 3 months ago at the board meeting, at one of our board meetings, which we term phased implementation. And phased implementation is something similar to what you're talking about. And we are, with phased implementation, we just have the issue that it is one phase that has to be planned to lead to further phases, so that at the end of the day, we meet what we believe is the requirement of the project, Prop 1A, and also the requirements of CEQA to declare and to say what the needs are, what the environmental needs are of the system we will finally be building.
How many phases are you anticipating on that corridor?
Well, that's the thing, Senator. When we launched this phased implementation, when we decided to go to the Central Valley and we had a bit more time on our hands, we said we now have to analyze phased implementation. Phased implementation is a more complicated issue because every section of the line between San Jose and down to Transbay Terminal has to be analyzed now and put into phases in a way that, if I were to give you an example, if you want to build a house and you know you're going to put a basement in it one day, you first got to put the basement in because you're not going to build the house and then later tear it down to put the basement in and start again. So more or less in that manner, you first got to define where you're going to get to, so that whatever you're building on top of it, or whatever you're going to be doing on top, doesn't have to be ripped down and rebuilt again later on. So phased implementation, which we just initiated a while ago, does exactly that. We set aside 1.5 years of going through the whole alignment to put phases in place so that we can up the alignment throughput. You must understand that even today, the alignment, the two-track alignment on the peninsula.
Mr. Van Ark, I apologize again for the interruption, but the question I had asked was how many phases. Is the short answer we don't know yet?
We
We're
have
still
to define
considering
it.
that?
We have to define it.
And yet the EIR process is underway, is that correct?
That's correct.
And an EIR typically is designed to assess the environmental impacts of a project, so if we don't know how many phases we're evaluating, how can we do the EIR?
No, the EIR is, there are various parts to the EIR, and I would hand it over to my expert when I need to, but the draft EIR document we would only be launching in the second half of 2012. So we are still working on the EIR document, and we have now agreed that within the EIR document we would define the phased implementation plan.
All right, I'm going to let you continue, and then I'm going to ask a couple questions about how we might get to yes, taking an optimistic view on all this. Go
Okay.
ahead.
So what I wanted to mention to you about the corridor as well is, there are people that are talking about a two-track final solution. Again, if you take two tracks and you run a service on two tracks, we talk about a thing called headway. Headway is the safety.
I apologize, but just to be clear, I don't think you see the phrase two tracks in the statement, do you?
No, I know. I say some people. I didn't say you've got it in yours. So, two tracks, I just wanted to give this example so that you do understand. If you've got two tracks and you have a headway of 5 minutes, that means the distance between the trains, the safety distance, is 5 minutes. That means you could theoretically run 12 trains an hour. When you start having high speed, higher speed, even the mini bullet or the baby bullets that they run today, and commuter trains stopping at every station, they interfere with each other's schedules. And as we see it today, and we're still busy doing further analyses, the capacity of that line, if you intersperse higher speed, not high speed, higher speed, and commuter rail services with each other, the capacity of the line is most likely in the region of about 6 trains per hour. Today, CalTrain already runs 5 trains an hour. CalTrain
Must be traveling at a different time than I'm trying to get on the CalTrain, just to, if you think
Yeah,
you're
but
5 trains an hour.
and Senator, sorry, Mr. Chairman, you're correct. They travel 5 trains an hour, but those trains take 40 minutes because they don't stop at every station. Of the 5 trains they operate, 2 trains are the baby bullets, so they only stop at certain stations. 2 trains are what we would refer to as milk trains, so they stop at many stations, but not on every station. And 1 train is in between. So that's the schedule that they run, meaning that they service stations kind of between
Every hour they run that?
No, they run 5 trains starting in the beginning and starting at the end every hour. But they don't. But I wanted to get to the point. They only service.
Mr. Van Ark, let's be clear about this.
Yes.
Senator Lowenthal, if I walk down to the train station at 2 o'clock in the afternoon in Palo Alto, I can assure you 5 trains are not going to be riding by that someone can get on to go north to San Francisco. I don't think that's what you're intending to suggest.
Okay, you're correct. I wanted to just come to the point of, if you run that service, you would still only service the stations in roughly every 40 minutes, on average. Some would.
If I was standing at that station at 2 o'clock between 2 and 3,
Yes.
maybe once every 40 minutes would a train stop there or so, but would I see 5 trains?
So the other disadvantage, you're right, no, not at 3 o'clock in the afternoon. So the other problem that you've got with high-speed rail and commuter rail is both services have got early morning and late afternoon peaks, both. You know that when you run an airport, the airports generally try and get the international traffic in around lunchtime, middays, because of the time shift between planes when they come in from other parts of the world. So that's how they try and schedule their schedules. High-speed rail, as well as commuter rail, have early morning passengers and they have late afternoon passengers, because if you as a business person want to travel, you generally want to leave early in the morning and get to your destination and do business. And then you want to come back in the late afternoon to get home for your evening. So that's the cycle. So when we talk about capacity, the peak capacities, early mornings and late afternoons, are very important. And unfortunately, the peak capacity of a commuter rail is similar to the peak capacity of a high-speed rail. It does not mean, again, that we do not want to move in this direction. Again, we've got limited capacity. We want to see whether we can use some of that limited capacity, and CalTrain is working with us. So we can use maybe 1 or 2 trains per hour and get high speed up and running in the corridor. But our main aspects remain the ones that, how do we meet the 30-minute time between San Jose to, because today it's 57 minutes. How do we meet the transition, the Prop 1A transition of the stations, which basically you need to reduce the time?
Does Prop 1A call out how many trains have to make it in that time?
In the time, no, they don't say how many trains have to make it.
So just to be clear, if a single train went from Los Angeles to San Francisco in the appointed time, that would meet the provisions of Prop 1A. Wouldn't be an ideal system. I think we can all agree on
yes,
that.
Yes, it says, I believe, it says without stopping. Yes,
okay.
That's correct.
All
and
right.
that's what it's designed
so
for.
So if any time of the day or night, 24 hours in a day, a train can make its way from Los Angeles to San Francisco in the allotted time, then we've complied technically with Prop 1A. So that takes that challenge off the table in my judgment, because we can clearly make that happen. Not suggesting for a minute that's what you want to produce or that that's what we want to see. So now we're back to the CEQA issue, which was the third piece of the proposal. And we've had a circular conversation on this, in my judgment, and I want to see if we can stop chasing ourselves around the table on this conversation. Here's the challenge. To date, the High Speed Rail Authority has insisted on doing a environmental analysis for what it calls full build-out of a phased system. I think that's a fair characterization. The point that Assemblymember Gordon and Congresswoman Eshoo and I made was we need to scale down the project to something that can be accommodated within the existing right-of-way and that does not involve an aerial viaduct and that works using the existing system, both to avoid costs and impacts. We've also then said in the third point that's made that we called on the authority to abandon its preparation of an EIR for a phased project of larger dimensions over a 25-year time frame. The authority then comes back and says, relying on its legal counsel, that's your cue, relying on its legal counsel, that, no, we have to do the EIR for the full phased project. To which I then say, you wouldn't have to do that EIR if you scaled back your definition of a project. To which you then say, but we have to comply with Prop 1A, to which I then say, you can comply with Prop 1A as a legal matter. So I'm going to turn to you and or your staff and or your legal counsel and say, is it your view that CEQA requires you to do an EIR for a project you do not propose to build? And if the answer to that question is no, because I'm thinking it's going to be no, then if we simply scale back the project, aren't we able to scale back the EIR? And the reason for this question is, I don't want to see an EIR proceed for a project that is never going to be built, that probably never should be built, but that puts a sword over the head of every property owner up and down this very developed 50-mile stretch of the corridor. Clear enough? So let's go to either you or your legal counsel.
If I may, Senator, purely technically, we couldn't even travel between San Francisco and San Jose in 30 minutes. You would have to rebuild the alignment to achieve that.
Well, you've talked about using the existing corridor for what you call Phase 1, as I understand it, and moving trains up and down that corridor at 120 miles per hour.
No, we wouldn't be running at 120 miles an hour initially in Phase 1, in the first phase. We would have to rebuild that corridor to be able to get to those speeds.
And what does rebuild that corridor mean?
There are many bridges, tunnels, alignments, curves that have to be changed and completely rebuilt.
Okay, but you're still talking about staying substantially within the right of way to do that,
Correct.
You're still talking about avoiding a viaduct. And so we're not talking about a multi-billion-dollar mega project. We're talking about staying substantially within the right of way, avoiding a viaduct, and moving a train at 124 miles an hour, am I remembering? And 124 miles an hour over, I'm going to call that 50 miles. Is that fair?
That's right.
Okay. So if we were talking about that, then you can do that in 30 minutes.
As if you rebuilt, yes.
Okay. So understanding that it's not as if we're going to take your 21st century CalTrain and put it on those squeaky old tracks that are still there, your 21st century high-speed rail program, put it on those squeaky old tracks. But you can, in fact, make it in half an hour from San Francisco to San Jose without building a viaduct and still staying substantially within the right-of-way, yes?
Yes, that's
Okay.
correct.
And if you can do it at 120 more miles an hour, you can get 50 miles in less than half an hour. And if you can do it in less than half an hour, you can comply with Prop 1A.
On that point, but not on the others.
Well, not on the others because?
Because the others require that I be able to transition stations.
And just to be clear, because there's been either some misunderstanding or misperception or misrepresentation about the proposal is to have people stay on the same train when they arrive in San Jose and move north to San Francisco. So south of San Jose, for the moment, and I understand that it will be an issue because I've got colleagues who've got interest in other parts of the geography, but south of there is not what I'm talking about. You told me in order to make it work, you had to be able to get from San Jose to San Francisco in half an hour, and we've now established that you can do that without building the multi-billion-dollar subsequent phases with the aerial viaduct outside the right-of-way.
Right.
To which I then say, great, why would we be pursuing an EIR for that scope of a project when there's no plan, when I'm suggesting, and others have suggested, that the plan should be scaled back to avoid the need to go in that direction? Let me just add, it's Ms. Aitchison?
Yes, that's correct.
And tell us a little bit about who you are and where you came from, what your practice is.
And you go first for that.
Sure. Good morning, Mr. Chairman and members of the committee. Thank you for allowing me to be here today. My name is Danae Aitchison. I'm a Deputy Attorney General with the Land Law Section of the Attorney General's Office. And attorneys from the Land Law Section of the office provide the authority with counsel on its environmental compliance with various matters, particularly its compliance with the California Environmental Quality Act. So I'm here today in my capacity as counsel to the client, not speaking for the office with a capital A and a capital G, but as counsel for the client on the environmental law issues.
So let me ask the question.
Certainly.
Does the High-Speed Rail Authority, and I love this, I'm getting free legal advice, so this is nothing but helpful. Does the High-Speed Rail Authority have to do an environmental assessment for a project it does not propose to build? That's a straight-out question, and I'd appreciate a straight-up answer.
I will do my very best to give you a straight-up answer. The High-Speed Rail Authority is an entity, like other state agencies, that can propose projects. It's proposing a project, it's a public project. The definition of that project is one that has to comply with the governing laws that it's operating under. It has to build the system that's set out for it in law to build. Assuming that the proposal on the table for a project complies with all of that, then the agency has discretion to determine exactly how it might want to phase that implementation of that project, but it always has to be studying under CEQA the full extent of reasonably foreseeable impacts of the whole project. So it really comes...
Stopping, please.
Okay.
Key phrase, whole project.
Yes.
So, just to be clear, and if I restate what you've told me in a way that you think is incorrect or misleading, I want to give you every opportunity to correct it. So, if the project were scaled back, and if it could be scaled back in a way that was compliant with 1A, then the only environmental assessment that would be necessary is for that scaled-back project, as long as the scaled-back project is compliant technically and legally with Prop 1A.
I think that's correct, but let me add one other thing, which is it wasn't entirely clear from the proposal regarding the time horizon issue and planning and doing environmental review out to the 2035 time frame. Now, I don't know if that's an aspect of this discussion here.
This is why I say this has been a circular conversation, and I think my goal is to make it, to stop, as I say, chasing around the table on this issue. I think the candor that Mr. Van Ark has provided and the candid answer you've given make it pretty clear. You do not have to do environmental assessment work for a project you are not proposing. And if you would recast the proposal, provided it is consistent with Prop 1A, then the environmental assessment work need only be done to the extent and scope of the recast proposal. We're clear on that?
I think we are clear on that, sir. The only key is that the time horizon, under CEQA, it is required that as you're studying the whole of the action that's on the table, even if phased, you have to examine the reasonably foreseeable impacts.
And what I'm saying is, and what the proposal from the 3 elected officials says is, there's a phase, and then you're done. And we're not talking about going beyond that with the multi-billion-dollar viaduct project that goes well outside the existing right-of-way. And if the High-Speed Rail Authority said, you know what, we're prepared to accept that as our project, even looking out over the long-term horizon, then that is the reduced project that they would then be obliged to do environmental work on, yes?
Yes, the key, of course, is whether or not the definition of that project would meet the design characteristics for the system that are set forth in the law.
In Prop 1A.
Correct.
Yes, great. Then I think we're headed down a good conversational path. Let me use a slightly more easily defined project. Have you ever been to the city of Palo Alto, where I live?
I certainly have. I'm a Stanford alum.
Great. Well, then you're familiar with what we call the Palo Alto process. In Palo Alto, we like to say that process is our most important product, actually, and I think Mr. Van Ark has been discovering that since his arrival in the community. If someone came to the Palo Alto City Council and said, I want to build a 400-unit condominium project. I want to do 200 units, and then 20 years from now, I want to come back and do another 200 units. You and I think, would agree that they have to do environmental assessment work for a 400-unit project, right?
I'm not sure I caught that. For the whole of the project?
For the whole of the project.
Correct, yes.
Yeah. But suppose the Palo Alto City Council said, as it might, you know, sorry, folks, you're only going to get to do 200 units. And you're only going to get to do 200 units, period, end of story, and that's what we're approving. Would the environmental assessment work only be for 200 units?
Well, under that particular circumstance, if your private applicant were to essentially withdraw, then the answer would be yes. And I think that's the question.
Let me just use a different phrase.
Okay.
If my private applicant were essentially to downsize his project from 400 units to 200 units and understand that that was the limited scope of the project, then that's the only thing that they'd be doing an EIR for, right?
Yes, that's correct. And the distinction would be, under that scenario, you may or may not have similar, legal implications for what is or isn't required as a public project. So here the authority is operating, as you have already identified, under the design characteristics of Prop 1A.
I think we're in my view, a much better place than we have been for a while, which is I think we have clarity that the authority's position is that it has to deliver a project that is technically compliant with Prop 1A. And by the way, I see our Assembly colleague, Assemblymember Galgiani. I'm sorry I didn't see you through the rail and the bodies, but welcome and thank you for being here. I appreciate your interest. We have to build a project that's, the authority's view is we have to build a project that's compliant with 1A, and we have to do an environmental assessment that would be compliant with CEQA for a Prop 1A compliant project. And to which I would then say, great, let's have a conversation about what a Prop 1A compliant project might look like that doesn't look like what is currently being proposed for phase implementation between the time of today and the year 2035. Thank you. Senator Lowenthal, now that you've learned more about the area I live in than you ever had hoped to, any comments or questions?
This has been an ongoing education seminar.
Thank
This
you.
is not a one-time
For all of us. For all of us.
education. So I'm just enjoying the process
All right.
and seeing how agreement is arrived at, and I'm very impressed.
Ms. Fuller, anything on this issue?
Actually, are we ready to move to Southern California for a moment?
We are. Once we finish this item up, I want to give these folks a moment to pause, catch their breath. But unless you have questions about this issue, what I would like to do is go to public comment on this issue. And actually, I think probably the best bet would be to say if folks who wanted to offer comment could offer comment just sort of roughly first on this issue if that's what they choose to speak to, and then others who have comments on high-speed rail, because we have a number of other items that follow. And let's get all of the public comment resolved, and then we'll go to members who have other issues for either the statewide implementation or for local aspects. Do we have members of the public who are here today to speak to this issue?